Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Give it another minute or so here.
Mark sent an email that he couldn't access it for some reason, so I told him it was working. We'll see if he can get on.
Okay.
Thank you.
He should have gotten it. Here he is. Hey, Mark.
Hello, everyone. I just left you a note. I tried to get in a couple times. It said it wasn't starting till 10 p.m., but maybe somebody updated the link. Thank you, Inga, for sending me the note. I appreciate it.
We got two more people joining here. All right, we're going to get started. This is being recorded, as you know, from the beeps or buzzers that went off. By way of brief introduction, Sam Imperati, the facilitator. Vance.
Vance Groening, County Council.
Ed.
Ed Patera, resident.
Greg.
Greg Barrett, Benton County Community Development.
Inga.
Inga Williams, County Planner.
Jeff.
Jeff Condit, Republic's local counsel.
Mark.
Mark Yeager, Benton County resident.
Catherine. So Catherine Bisco is here as well virtually, as is everyone, and we'll proceed. So by way of brief background, given the time that we have to accomplish this task, the CUP subcommittee met earlier in the week and suggested that an introductory set of sentences be added to the top of the evolving, still draft CUP document. Mark Yeager took the first shot at that. Ed Patera reviewed it favorably. Those were the comments I received. Because I'm sort of the in-between person to make sure all these subcommittees are communicating. I took that document, sent it to the legal subcommittee, who worked on it, I believe it was Tuesday afternoon. Greg put together the best he could under short notice, the current state of the document, which was sent out to you yesterday. And we're here today. We received feedback that Mark found it problematic. Ed thought it was best to sit down as the big group. I mean, the two subcommittees as a big group and work it through. So that's our purpose today. is to do that. I'm going to share my screen, and while I'm doing that, did anyone else have any things they want to add for context here? So hearing none, the track change version is what and that's what you received last night. I then went in and created a quote unquote clean version, meaning I simply accepted what had said in case people want to work from that document to avoid the clutter. I'm happy to facilitate this on document A, which is this, or document B, which is a draft, which I can track change here in real time. If folks have a preference as to which version would be the most helpful to get us to yes, Mark.
I have a preference for document A, please.
Okay. Anyone else have a strong preference either way?
I prefer to see the red line.
Okay, so that's A. All right, well, we have a
You're breaking up, Sam. I can't hear you if you're talking.
you can assume I'm always talking, Mark, and for some reason, my screen just went dead. So hopefully is this now visible, and can I be heard?
You can be heard, and yes, the screen share has come up.
Okay, so I thought I'd start off by asking each of you, what are the main purposes of this set of paragraphs or this document? What are the main purposes first, and then go through what are either the objections to language you see here, or suggestions for us to get to yes in the limited amount of time we have. So what is the main purpose? Let's start with you, Mark, as you were the original author, so to speak.
Sure, thanks, Sam. What I thought would be important, so the subcommittee has been working from the 50 to 60 page doc.
Well, now Mark is frozen, at least on my end.
All right, I'll wait till we catch up. Are we here? Can you
Mark,
hear me?
what last we heard is that we had been working from a 50, 60 page document.
Okay, yeah, and I felt that, I suggested to the subcommittee that it might be helpful, since this will ultimately become a public document. It's a public document now, but ultimately it's going to be published as a work group report or sub report, that there be some introduction so that the average person would have some understanding of why we're going through the exercise of listing and reviewing prior land use actions associated with the landfill properties. So that was the rationale for trying to draft something up, and then Sam and the subcommittee directed me to give it a shot, so I did.
Okay, let's because I can't, my screen here is flummoxed. Ed.
What I was looking for was the intent was a complete historical record of what the documents are, an assessment of what we know about those documents, and pointing to things that are loose ends, things that need confirmation, or things that suggest we need to add in other resources. And I can give you examples when you want to get to that stage.
Okay. Who else from that subcommittee is,
My understanding was the same as Mark's.
the call? Who else from that subcommittee?
This is Jeff. I'm on both subcommittees. My
Um,
understanding is also the same as Mark's.
So who else is on that? Who's there at that meeting? Catherine?
Catherine was there, yeah.
So I support the direction that we're headed. I think one of the first things that I see is just in that language at the very, very beginning is that we somewhere acknowledge the phrase conditions of approval. I think it's an essential part of that land use process and those decisions. So for me, there's some fine nuances in that we are staying consistent with language, and conditions of approval or CUP is certainly language we've included. So that introduction for me is important as well.
And then goals from the legal committee's perspective when you read this document, which and goal for today. It looks like we'll start with Jeff and then hit Vance next.
Well, I think what we tried to do in the legal subcommittee is make all the relevant points in a way that was neutral and was actually legally compliant. And so we sort of worked through wordsmithing. I mean, I don't think we had any objections to any of the content, but we just felt it could be better stated.
Vance?
Yeah, I would agree with Jeff. I think the legal subcommittee's objective was to kind of revise this away such that the presentation was neutral. I think the other thing that I was looking at was more of a generic statement about land use conditions as opposed to Republic specific, so to speak. Just because some of the statements in there were, they would be taken by members of the public and applied countywide to all kinds of land use actions. So we wanted to try to make sure that the statements were applicable across the board.
Okay. Any other intent thoughts before we move on?
I'll just add, one of my interests is to ensure that terms are clear and consistent in their usage.
Okay. All right, so let's look at the track change version, which should be displayed on your screen. And let's try to focus in on what was added or what was deleted by the legal subcommittee as the ones that you want to talk about. We'll talk about them later, but I want to see how much text we have to really dive into today. So Catherine, Ed, or Mark, looking at the document in front of you, let me know which paragraphs, or maybe let me know which sentences are okay, and I'll highlight them so we can try to triage this thing.
For me, the only complete paragraph that was okay was the fourth implementation of, or excuse me, the third implementation of conditions of approval. I didn't have any comments or reaction to that one.
Okay. How about Catherine or Mark? Is that paragraph sentence, is that okay from your perspective?
That third paragraph is fine as written.
Yeah, the yellow here.
Yeah.
Catherine?
Yeah,
Okay with it?
agreed.
Okay, so let's take the first, so that's assuming there's challenges with the rest. So let's start with paragraph 1 here and let me know how this can be improved from starting with the CUP perspective.
Do you want us to just wait until you call upon us, or should we just?
No, just jump in here, given the time, just talk
All
over
right.
me.
Well, I'll jump in first, and a couple of things. I didn't particularly have any issue with the first line where Greg added in findings of facts and notices of decision. That was okay. I think that Catherine mentioned just a minute ago conditions of approval. So the average member of the public is not going to know that the conditions of approval are contained within the notice of decision. So I'll let her speak to that. I didn't have any particular objection to that. I didn't find, I'm just going to talk about the first paragraph at this point. I didn't find it particularly helpful to have the parenthetical phrase, if it can be determined. I didn't see what that added to the paragraph, and actually made it somewhat more confusing. That's the whole point of what we're doing as a subcommittee, is going through to the best of our ability, make a determination as to whether or not compliance or non-compliance has occurred. So I didn't see that parenthetical phrase added anything. The subcommittee did specifically talk about that it was important to review the background materials. And so I object to the striking of that sentence. I wrote that, I believe, to reflect the discussion that we had at the subcommittee level. And then, and also I didn't find, similarly to the parenthetical, if it can be determined, I didn't find any value to the last sentence that was added. I didn't see how that helped anything. Again, my audience here, when I tried to write this, was to reflect the discussion we had at the subcommittee level and try to provide an introduction to the average public who doesn't understand land use in general, and give them some rationale for why are we doing this and why is it important. So I'll stop there.
So give me a specific, so I'm going to actually, with your permission, drive this conversation today because of the time constraint. I mean, I think this concept, if it can be determined, was put forward by the legal subcommittee in part to recognize that A, we are not going to determine whether or not it's in compliance or not. We're putting together a document that provides the best information. And the other piece was here is that this is an issue that the legal subcommittee is working on. They haven't yet. There seems to be fidelity in the legal subcommittee that the franchise agreements start anew with each subsequent franchise agreement. They haven't gotten to the point of researching whether or not a condition of approval carries forward, or is it trumped or rendered moot by other conditions of approval. That's a process going forward. So I guess my suggestion for there is to basically say it is to recognize those two things if we can. So
I understand what you're trying to do, and I think that's a good idea, but I don't think it belongs in this part. It's almost like a parallel activity, and it shows down, it should be maybe at the bottom, explaining what the next committee, use the words you used and put it in at the bottom, saying, hey, this is additional work. And mention the franchise agreements. That's all good. There's clearly uncertainty. What I reacted badly to was the way it's structured. It came across as trying to lead people to say, hey, this is a useless activity. It wasn't illuminating. It was just covering things over.
Right. So,
So
legal
Sam,
go ahead, Catherine.
to that point, I'm wondering if, so I like Ed's suggestion of removing that last statement, putting it towards the end as not a whether or not, but maybe it remains to be seen. It seems like it is taking one side more than another just in the language choice. So if maybe we could temper that language, but I also agree with Mark and that first, I can't see it right now, but that very first phrase, if it can be determined or whatever that was, I think that leads in a direction that isn't necessary at that point. And I too feel that isn't necessarily the intent of that first statement. So where it is, if it can be determined, I don't see the value in that space. And I actually feel like that's almost redundant with that last statement. Like that's a very similar kind of sentiment, and might best just be captured in that last sentence at the end of the document.
Legal folks, subcommittee folks, any objections to this emerging theme? Because I think where this is going to end up is, with your permission, is I'm going to do a facilitator's draft of this. And maybe because we're not going to have the time to vet this back and forth and look for hanging participles and split infinitives, that maybe this is phrased as facilitators proposed language or something, or language in process or something for today.
That's excellent. And let me put in the third voice on it. If it can be determined, for not having that, I think that in my first couple of reads suggested that we would be eliminating documents from the list of describing the Coffin Butte situation if their compliance or non-compliance couldn't be determined. It was more mechanics. I want to make sure the record is clear. Everything that you can find is on the list, and we're not taking things off the list. We can explain later that the impact is indeterminate, but that's a separate discussion from a complete list.
Okay. Folks, Jeff,
So
Vance.
I wasn't intending that. I suggested this addition on the legal committee, and I really meant is, I think what Ed just said is that if it can be determined from the record, because that may not be possible.
Yeah, and that again goes back at the kind of the bottom of, how do you use this document? It's understood that blah, 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 we may not be able to determine something. But we've also picked up nuggets along the way already in pointing to, there's a bunch of things that really needs DEQ's information. And that's kind of out of the scope right now, but we may want to just point to that, is to flesh out this document, you really need the DEQ communications, like, have there been any notices of non-compliance? Have there been any certifications of compliance? That's a whole missing block from my perspective. I don't know how to get at that right now, but other than asking DEQ to list it for us. You see where I'm going?
Yep.
Well, the DEQ compliance process is completely separate from the county conditions of approval process. And the purpose of this committee is to review those conditions of approval. And I agree, in order to go back and have a historically accurate record, we have to review all of the documents, but we may not be able to determine that. I raised that point in the meeting on Monday. The 1974 decision is 50 years old almost, and the landscape has changed out there. We may not be able to determine whether Republic did or did not comply with all those conditions of approvals. And so that's so, you know, if the purpose of this is just to state the conditions of approval are imposed on land use decisions in order to comply with the applicable criteria. It's important to build the historic, you know, for the purposes of building a historic record, that we review those past conditions and try to determine compliance if it's feasible based upon the record. I think that's the whole purpose of the committee here. So, Sam, if you want to take a crack at trying to put all that stuff together, I'm willing to take a look at it.
Well, no, just wait before we defer it to Sam. You know, we've had the discussion a couple of times in the subcommittee. Well, actually, at the first meeting, you know, 2-3 weeks ago, and it was asked that and pointed out that things can change. Some things might have been superseded by other items, and I think that's extremely important. And I believe we started to address that, and that should be included in this document. I've provided some. Jeff, you've committed to have your staff review things and provide the updates to identify what's superseding. But I think we have to make that effort to, hey, we've looked at the documents and we can't find anything that supersedes this, or we've clearly found something that supersedes this. And we have at least one example that's been put out that I put out last week for your comment. I know it was not in the revised document from Monday, that's just a reformatting. So I'm getting a little concerned that we've got information, we can stack it up. We need to start populating a document with the results of those efforts to determine if something has been superseded.
So let me
think about this, but I'm concerned about going around in circles.
So listen, I think the reality is that we don't know the full extent of the record yet, what's missing and what we need to get. And at the end of the day, the result of that subcommittee process may be we have different points of view as to whether or not the record supports compliance or non-compliance, and it's going to be reported out that way. The reality is on 11/17 at 10:28 a.m. is, you know, this thing I just added, whether it can be determined from the record is a work in progress. We don't know yet. And I don't think we need, I think we need to go get it, but I don't think we need to set up language here that gives anyone an advantage in the subsequent negotiations, because any subsequent negotiation about whether or not there's been compliance or not is not ripe yet. We don't know. We're just getting the information to figure it out.
But to recognize that there are differences that may arise, I think putting it at the end is important. It just doesn't need to be in the first paragraph.
And that's what all this is. That I'm typing in here as notes to put that in there at the end, in lieu of coming up with something that reconciles this with that. I think we've got as much as we can on here. Let's go to
Well,
Catherine.
hold on. Yeah, hold on for a second, because this whole sentence that's been deleted, the one that says review of the background documents, etc. I wrote that because I thought that was a very specific discussion and agreement among the subcommittee that was important. So I don't know what we're doing with this.
Well, what we're doing with this from my perspective, thinking out loud, and I'm sorry to be pushy here, it's only the function of the time. And if we can't get to yes on this, then we can't, and we'll save it for, you know, a period of time necessary to do it.
Well,
to me,
can we hear from Ed and Catherine as to whether or not they think that is important?
To me, that's essential, and it's begun, and we should just recognize where it's a work in progress. and find some mechanism to communicate that, whether it's called it a draft A1 or a revision as of this date, but just recognize what has been found to date and say, hey, we're still looking.
So I'm not taking their side. I'm just giving you history. This sentence that I've got in gray was thought to be duplicative of this, provides important context regarding the history of landfill properties. It was an attempt to add findings of fact, notices, decisions, and put that up there. And then there's not, the concern is, how is that sentence different than the one above it?
Because the one, and I'd add something into the one above it, which is code approvals or amendments, where you have the EGs. But what it's identifying is that the supporting information may be in the record. And that the documents are available and they just need to be reviewed. We're not just trying to say, hey, this complies or doesn't comply. I thought we were trying to say, this is the information we have to date. This is where something's been superseded. This is where we can't find anything yet. And that's what the review of the background documents does. It's not just the land use actions. It could be other things, like you brought in franchise agreements. That's a possibility. I've reviewed the 2021, 2020, I guess it is, and I don't see anything that applies to some of these things. But that's where we get into opinions. We can look at memorandums of understanding, and I've looked at some of those. They're not land use documents, but there's an important one in 2016 that makes no reference to geographical areas, so it doesn't impact the land use decisions. As we find things that are in the record that are related but are relevant, I think they need to be included, and that's only possible through that review of the background documents section. Because the background documents are not just the county decisions. They're all the other things too.
I thought this sentence was important primarily because of the words, it provides context. I think what Ed just said is I'm in agreement with that. The notices of decisions do not give you the tone and tenor of, why something was approved or possibly denied. And so that context, at least in my view, was the important piece of this sentence, was to talk about not just the notice of decision or findings of facts, because we have all those records and they do provide a picture, a snapshot, if you will, of what was happening and what was being discussed at the time these particular land use activities or land use actions were being reviewed and acted upon.
Okay, so I will do my best to reconcile provides an important historical through line with provides important context regarding. I think those, I got to be honest with you. I understand the need for accuracy here. And I think someone outside of this conversation who looked at the words providing important context versus it provides an important historical through line is not going to appreciate the distinction. But I'll do my best to merge those sentences into one construct.
Sure.
But we need to move on. What about this here?
Wait, Sam, can
Yes.
I ask a question? On that first paragraph, you put in code approvals. What do we mean by that? That doesn't quite jibe with the terminology Benton County uses, so I'm not quite sure what that refers to.
Can I try that?
Yep.
It's a wrong word. I didn't know what to do. In reviewing some of the documents, the supporting piece clearly says it's an order for a code amendment, but I don't know what the right term is for when you first agree to a code.
Actually, Sam, stop. I just put code amendment. That, because I think what you're talking about, it is amending the development code. And that's the correct term for that. Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's how we refer to changes to the development code or
Yeah.
code amendment.
So I'd suggest code adoption and amendments. So I think that was Ed's point was.
Yeah, it was code adoption is closer to the,
That's first.
yeah,
and
I
then
don't know the
amendment.
legal terms, but that's much closer to the concept I had.
All right, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that what what we were writing actually reflects how we actually talk when we discuss these things.
Perfect.
And then if I could add real briefly, Sam, I think there's an important, all of us, I think there's an important distinction between background documents, which are valuable for context, and the potentially legally binding items, which are the findings of fact and notice of decision with conditions of approval. So that's a subtle nuance, but it's important because something that's in the file but is not a condition of approval doesn't have legal binding. It's still valuable for context. So if there's a way to describe that, capture that point, that would be good.
And to me, that goes at the bottom and says, these are the kinds of screening, these are the kind of criteria that will be applied to determining the relevance of something.
Okay. I thought it was so important that folks wanted it up front, this part up front. I can move it.
No, I'm confusing things. Don't go with what you have.
Okay.
And let's just see where we are. We're completing your time.
Okay, what about this, folks?
So this is Mark. I was attempting, and maybe the words I chose were not satisfactory to folks, but to put the language in here that says, I'm sorry, I have to get closer to this thing, to demonstrate compliance with applicable criteria. I understand that that's the sort of legal context, but from the average person's perspective as it relates to land use, that wording is land use gobbledygook from my perspective. The idea behind conditions of approval, to put them in English for the average person, is you have a proposed land use that's required to go through a conditional use permit because it's not allowed as an outright use. The conditions of approval are those requirements that once implemented will make the proposed use compatible the uses in the zone. So to put in compliance with applicable criteria is legally correct, but I don't think it helps the average public person understand what's attempting to be done.
So how can we merge those two concepts together and say more than just applicable? Greg, do you have a thought that helps with that?
Well, my approach to this suggestion, my suggested approach to this is to work on coming up with more everyday language for the phrase demonstrate compliance with applicable criteria, because conditions of approval are not solely to mitigate impacts of inherently incompatible land uses. You can have a condition of approval that's necessary to meet some review criterion that doesn't have to do with inherently incompatible land uses. So
Yeah, I recognize that, Greg, when I was writing that, because there's some conditions of approval that say, go get a DEQ permit. But again, trying to write this for the average
Sure.
human being, I didn't want to get into those nuances. And so that's why I wrote what I wrote. But yeah, I recognize there are some things that you got to go check this box, and it's not really having to do with mitigation.
It's
So
just
if
county
there's,
regulations. I mean, that's what we're trying to say, right? You're going to ensure compliance with county regulations. It's not applicable criteria. I agree that the average Joe's not going to understand that term, but regulations, everyone understands.
well, I think regulations, but I also think that the concept of compatible uses, that's why we have land use planning in Oregon. It's to ensure that we have reasonably compatible land uses adjacent or nearby. So I think people would understand that you wouldn't build a chemical manufacturing plant in the middle of a residential area because it's an incompatible use. So again, that's the theme I was trying to get at there, that conditions of approval are an effort to take a land use, and if implemented, that would help to ensure that that proposed land use was compatible with adjacent uses.
So let's focus on actual language. That's the only way out of this box, sports fans. So I'm just throwing something up there to get us language oriented. Is necessary to demonstrate compliance with applicable laws designed to meet the county's land use goals. Does that work?
That doesn't work for me, but I think I've said what I need.
Here's
but-
a suggestion. To ensure the proposed use complies with county regulations, including compatibility with neighboring land uses.
That's better. I appreciate that. You know, I guess once everything's written down, I think, Sam, you're going to go away and try to craft something up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in concept, what Greg has just proposed there is helpful. Again, trying to get to this compatibility piece, the whole purpose of land use planning.
Okay. All right. I'll do the best I can on that to get us a draft. Let's go on to this here.
So Sam, I only had blocked out a half an hour for this and we're quite a bit over that. I need to jump
Sorry.
off. I'm looking forward to your revision, and I do support kind of that direction of where Greg's opinion on how to tweak that last paragraph to make that a little more user friendly or publicly friendly. But I do have to leave, so I'll look for your draft.
Thanks so much.
Review. Thanks.
Okay. This one was okay, as I recall.
Mhm.
So what about this here?
My only reaction to that was the second sentence. The approval is the responsibility of the applicant. I think that was one of the questions that got raised when we did the tabulation. So that's fine there. It could also be handled as a comment in the actual table, the 50-odd page document.
And Ed, this was one of the sentences we talked about as being more generally applicable to land uses across the board.
Yep.
So that's why we thought it was germane to this paragraph.
Yeah, and in the way I interpret it is the RSI was Republic was the applicant for some operations, land uses that were really being run by Knife River. And this just says Republic is responsible for those operations with permitting requirements, et cetera. I'll pull out the particular language and maybe just give it to you later today when I see you. I'll just find some way to point it out to you, because that has very severe implications from my perspective.
So in terms of this paragraph, well, I know in practice, this is what happens. The sentence that says compliance with the required conditions of approval are the responsibility of the applicant. It seems to me that for people to have trust and confidence in the land use planning process, what this does is abrogates any responsibility of Benton County to ensure that the notice of decision or conditions of approval are actually implemented. And to me, that seems like a reach too far to say that, well, once we write them down, we don't have anything to do with them. I don't really think that's true. I do think that the county does have a responsibility to ensure that they're complied with, monitored, and enforced. And if we accept this statement as it is, it says county doesn't have any responsibility for that. And I just don't think that's right.
So to clarify, we were drawing a distinction between the terms compliance and enforcement. So compliance is meeting the conditions of approval. And the applicant, by definition, they're the ones operating, they're the ones who have primary responsibility to comply with conditions of approval. Monitoring and enforcement is another matter. And so that's why monitoring and enforced when necessary is we thought was important in that sentence. So again, compliance is the act of complying with conditions, monitoring and enforcing if the conditions are not being met with, that is the county's responsibility.
Okay, well then, if you want, I thank you, Greg, for that clarification and distinction. I appreciate that. If we want to put this sentence in, then I think there should be an additional sentence that that monitoring and enforcement is the responsibility of the county, so that it's explicit here. Because when I read this, I saw it as what I said, an abrogation of the county's responsibility to do anything with regard to this. So I know we have the next paragraph, which says you don't have the resources to do it. But my suggestion would be if we put this sentence in, there should be a follow-on sentence that says it's the county's responsibility to monitor and enforce the conditions or the compliance.
And where I came across was on the next paragraph down where it says typically, I would have thought you could put in the responsibility for enforcement. County has responsibility for enforcement and addressing it is complaint driven. I think you got two concepts here. You're not going to go out and I think someone called it the compliance police. We're not going to do that. But is the county is responsible for enforcement and the complaints are, it's a citizen obligation, or I don't know how you do that. That's getting too far. I think you've said it when you just say complaint driven.
Well, and I guess I would suggest that since we've jumped to this next paragraph, rather than say typically, I would say in Benton County, enforcement is complaint driven, because typically makes it sound like nobody does it. So I would prefer that it say in Benton County.
Actually, Mark, that is something we did talk about. And as Jeff Condit pointed out, who has much greater experience across the state than I do, most counties have a complaint-driven process, so it is typical. It's not just Benton County that doesn't have the resources or personnel.
Yeah, I realize that, Vance, but I don't think that it's necessarily appropriate to this sort of implies that nobody does it. And so I think it's more accurate to say, because there might be some counties that do it, there might be some cities that do it. So in this case, it seems to me, why don't we just narrow it to specifically what we know for sure? And we know for sure in Benton County that it's complaint driven.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't think it makes any difference.
In my experience in Deschutes County and Sun River is very different than, it is more in tune with what Mark said as opposed to what Jeff said was uniform.
Well, Sun River definitely has enforcement, but that's a private organization too.
Mhm.
All right.
Yeah, look up the code compliance policies of Deschutes County.
Right. I can only imagine. Any other suggestions for improvement, folks? Because I've
Looks
got
like
to
you
be
got
in-
some, looks like you got some work to do there, Sam, and I appreciate you taking a shot at, happy to help or whatever.
Yeah.
The
Well,
only comment I would make is down below where you added in some stuff about the franchise agreement and CUP. I really see those as separate. The franchise agreement is not land use. So however we incorporate that, I'll be a little sensitive to that because they are compliance with the franchise agreement is separate and apart from land use decisions, in my view.
I agree with that.
Yeah, they clearly are. And this was simply my note to remind me that there's emerging consensus that franchise agreements live anew with each new one, whereas the issue of the CUP compliance living on has not yet been resolved. So that's
Sure.
the avenue I am
Sure.
taking. Now, here's the practical consideration. I've got to be in my car heading south at 11:30. All I can do is take one quick and dirty shot at this and send it out. My concern is, given how we've been resolving this, which has been in good faith and collaborative, we're not going to get there because people are rightfully very concerned about every word and concept and the implication going forward, as they should be. So I'm thinking that the overwhelming odds are that I'm not going to be able to give you a bunch of sentences that all of you are going to go, wow, let's put him in the Mediator Hall of Fame. But instead, you're going to say, well, what about this and what about that? Which I'm only pointing out, not because you shouldn't do it, and not because I don't want you to do it. I'm going to be in a car.
I don't think there's any rush to get this done from my perspective.
Well, if that's the case, then
I don't know if other people think that. Yeah, I don't know if other people think that. This isn't something that we need to roll out today at the public meeting.
I don't believe so. I think I'd clean it up and get closer to consensus. I do think it's a wonderful example of cross subcommittee collaboration, beginning with it. When you were starting to run into bumps that cross over somewhere else, we're getting other people to talk and move forward to a final report.
Yeah. All right, good. Then that's a major relief. I thought our goal was to get this for the open house or the meeting. And if it's not,
I don't think so.
Then Godspeed. That just takes a lot of pressure off. And I should have asked that ahead of time because that was driving my desire to push here. So I apologize. And I will draft something up and then we'll vet it in between. And then obviously the final emerging version will be looked at the next subcommittee meetings of each of these groups. And if we have to have a joint one, we'll do it again. assuming Mark Yeager brings the joints.
So that sounds great to me. Sam, are you going to circle back with Catherine to let her know where we ended up, or do you want one of us to do that?
Could you? Because I am just trying to get out all the other stuff for the meeting.
Okay, yeah, I can follow up with her and just tell her what I'll say is we worked on some additional changes to the document. Sam's gonna send out a proposal to us for consideration, and we won't have anything ready for today, just so she knows that.
All right. Thank you both. All three of you, four of you, five of you, however many's on the call. See you at 2:45. Ciao.
Good work,
Thanks for
folks.
Yeah.
your efforts.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
bye. Thanks, everyone.